I know that's not the standard that Oklahoma's set for themselves, but I'll tell you, we'll trade. We'll trade you. It's rough in Morgantown right now. It's been a rough week, the roughest I can remember in my history of watching West Virginia football. It's been bad.
Yeah, it's one thing to have a down season that doesn't meet expectations, but if that's compiled against some other issues in maybe recruiting not being quite what it should be, and then the poor season last year, then you start to hear the calls for the coach. So that's what we've been hearing. I don't know that there's with the likes of Scott Frost and Brian Harsin off the market, that Neil Brown has ascended to the top of most hot seat lists in America, Paul.
Yeah, and it's funny. I've been getting conflicting reports. Earlier in the weekend, after the game, we were told that it was probably going to be a done deal before Saturday. Now it's completely reverse course, and we're told he's been asked to just retool the entirety of the staff, and that he probably will be retained because we do have a recruiting class that just jumped up into the top 25. Another 4-star commit over the weekend,
Okay.
Which is we're getting close to 7, 8 4-star commits in this class. So, uh, it's just the oddest thing that I talk about a lot. He's built this culture. Everybody likes him. Parents like him. Coaches like him. Uh, it's just the on the field portion of it. It's the only proponent that's missing. I'm sure it's happened before, but it's just very something can't put your finger on. Not exactly sure why it's happening. So their buyout's a big portion of that.
Yeah, the buyout always comes up. So what does that
Yeah.
buyout look like?
Well, after the season, it drops to a little over 16 million. There is language, according to a friend of ours, Travis Kenobi, who's read over the contract. There's language in the contract that does protect the university. Um, Still not exactly sure, but we think over a period of maybe 3 or 4 seasons it can be paid. But all those things have to be worked out and negotiated. So nothing is in stone. We just know that as of right now it's 20 million, and then after the season it drops down to 16.7 ish. So that's where we're at with it, which is, for us, it's a larger amount, especially since, our athletic budget is pretty much null and void. What we make, we spend mostly. So even though we have a healthy overall athletic department and balance and budget, according to Tony Altimore, it's still, we're not Oklahoma. We don't make that kind of money here. So we can't really afford to, you're not working out. We'll just pay this buyout and let's go get Hugh Freeze. We do have certain reports coming out that the Arizona Diamondbacks owner, Kendricks, who was a donor of West Virginia, is supportive of a past coach. These are all rumors, but I have heard it from 2 different sources, and that's usually the rule you go by. If you hear it from 2 different sources, you report the rumor. So that's what I'm doing. Um, there's people that want Rich Rodriguez back, and they're willing to possibly pay that buyout for him. But like you see how I've gone back and forth on this. You hear from so many different places in the media, um, people that are working closer to the program than I am. So it's been a heck of a weekend and early week. I was really glad to get my mind off it and watch some college basketball last night.
All right. So one more follow up on the Neil Brown situation, and then we'll swing this, of course, to the Oklahoma camp because this is our Sooner show, and we
Yeah.
want to size up the matchup here. So, where do you stand on Neil Brown's performance? I've heard you make the comment that he's a great Sunday through Friday coach,
Yeah.
doesn't get the job done on Saturday. Where do you stand on what is the best course of action, whether that's to part ways with Neil Brown? Let's say the buyout's not a consideration. Best
Mm-hmm.
route is to part ways with Neil Brown, or give him a nudge to retool or a mandate, or what do you think? What would be the best course of action for you?
For me personally, I think just cutting bait and moving on is the way to roll. Um, I watched him very closely on the sidelines. As somebody that works in the counseling field away from YouTube, um, he is definitely the saying pressure bust pipes comes to mind. I've saw that happen a few times on the sideline. Throughout his course and his tenure over the course of 4 years, I can point out at least a dozen occasions when he's made coaching decisions that I don't think elite coaches make, or coaches that are even Power Five level. So I don't think those things are fixable, and I think at the group of five level, when there was less pressure, you play with a little bit more house money. When he was at Troy, I think that was had a lot to do with their success. Um, but I would love to be wrong, and I don't make these decisions. But for me, I would move on from Neil Brown. There are candidates out there that want to come to West Virginia. West Virginia in the past has been a designation spot and a place coaches like to go in some cases in the past, it's been to step up. But for the most part, we feel like we're a landing spot for coaches where they can dig in and win for a long time. We just need the right guy.
So these two teams are in the same bucket in certain respects. Justin, looking at the 2022 season, far beneath expectations. West Virginia needs to win 3 consecutive games to get to a bowl game. That would seem like a monumental feat at this point. Oklahoma, more manageable, 2-1, which seemed, or 1-2, I should say, only needing the 1 out of the 3. So I will serve this one up, and then I'll let Jason dive in, and you guys can carve up the X's and O's. But for a team playing out the string, with certain guys having NFL futures, other guys thinking, okay, am I going to transfer? Where do I stand here? What is the situation going to be with the coaching situation? What can be achieved in the final 3 games? How important do you think these games are?
For me first?
Yeah.
Okay. Monumental. This has the potential to be the best recruiting class in West Virginia University history. There are a few that you can point to that are similar, but I can name them. Justin Benton, Joey Porter Jr., Rodney Gallagher, Ray that just signed over the weekend. We have several high-end 4-star prospects in this class. We definitely want to keep them. So these last 3 games, I think, if we could go on a 3-game run, absolutely, that would change a lot of the narrative this season. To have almost a month's worth of positivity rather than the negativity that's just been spewed all over social media. I'm actually corresponding with one of our recruits right now to talking about doing a video about that, about how that hurts the program, and getting a recruit's perspective on what social media is to them and how they view it when fan bases do what we've done, because we have such a large following on Twitter that I feel like we've hurt our program, and I'm included in that. I've done it too, so obviously these last 3 games are huge. Unfortunately, we're not sure about the quarterback spot and what JT Daniels is going to be or what he's done. He's been very up and down. I've done several videos on that. His Pro Football Focus grade rests at about a 67 for the season, which is what Pro Football Focus considers to be a backup. So not really, what we thought he would be coming in, the pedigree, the 5-star pedigree. Not impressed with it. So a lot of people were thinking that maybe he's been injured, just hasn't said anything because this is his last chance. But that's all speculative, and I can't really, it hasn't been reported. So, but yeah, these last 3 games would be a big deal.
All right. You have anything, Jason?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you've got 2 programs that look like right now, unfortunately, are very much headed in the same direction this year, right? I mean, I know that Oklahoma's not anywhere near the point of discussion here from a coaching perspective, right? With it being Venable's first year, but I think it's interesting coming into this game because it's 2 teams that are very disappointed in where they're at with how the season has gone, and where they're at right now. And you've got guys that you don't know where their head is at when they play out the stretch, right? On the Oklahoma side, you've got some guys. Are they thinking about where they're going to go next year from a portal perspective? Are they thinking about some of the draft eligible kids? Are they kind of thinking about where their draft grade is, and maybe they're not giving the same type of effort, trying to not stay injured or not get injured or things like that. And I think there's disappointment all across the board. I know that you'd mentioned that obviously there's a difference in the programs, kind of from a historic perspective, but I think both teams are very similar in a lot of ways. This year I think defensively both teams have taken a fairly significant step back. I know that West Virginia has been historically over the last few years has been a very solid defensive football team, but not as much this year, particularly in the back half of the secondary. I think Oklahoma's the same way. It's been very consistently bad. I go into this game, I don't know how either team is going to stop the other.
I question for you about that. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you made a point.
No, go ahead.
You guys go, what, 7-ish deep in that wide receiver room? I know there's Weiss, Farouk, Mims, Stoops, Gibson, Hester. Who am I missing? You guys are so deep in the receiver room. And you mentioned our back half. Who's been performing? You said Mims had a comeback game last week. Who has been your best overall receiver this year?
Yeah, Mims is still the best overall receiver. He's got almost 700 yards on the season, only 4 touchdowns, but he did have a very atypical game against Iowa State. Only had a couple of catches for 14, 15 yards, had a lot of drops in that game. And as I mentioned, came back strong, had a 100-yard performance against Baylor. But I think you mentioned they're fairly, they're not as deep as you kind of thought that they would, but there's not a lot of game changers in that wide receiver group outside of probably, I would say, Marvin Mims and Jalil Farouk. Theo Weiss he's a shell of himself, of where he was. He was a 5-star prospect. He was part of that trio of 5-star receivers that Oklahoma had got, and with injuries and things like that, he's just not the same. He's just not the same receiver. So Braden Willis at the tight end, he's kind of a tight end, a flex guy. He's second in the team in receptions with 25 catches for 347 yards on the season. So the receivers, I think to your point, they are deep, but they're not as, I don't think they're quite as talented. It hasn't been as productive as a lot of us thought that they would be coming in. And I think, you'd mentioned JT Daniels and kind of talking on the reverse side of it about Dylan Gabriel. I think there's a lot of things coming into this season that you as an Oklahoma fan, you knew that he's not as good as Caleb Williams, obviously.
Right.
He's just in terms of his feed and what he brings. But I think the accuracy at times or lack thereof has been something that's a little bit surprising. But he's been able to protect the ball. Having said that, really well. Only had 1 interception on the year up until Saturday, and had 3 in the first half against Baylor. So I think there's there's concern there, kind of from decision-making perspective, and I get it. Like, Oklahoma has had a very, very high threshold from a quarterback perspective over the last 5 to 7 years, and so anyone that's not kind of at that Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, Jalen Hurts level, I think is a little bit. But I think he's a solid quarterback. He's not anyone that's really going to beat you, but he's not the guy. He's going to take the whole team on his shoulders and go, win a 52-49 game by himself, right? So I think that's interesting. I think I come into this game seeing that Oklahoma's I don't know what it is now, but I think at one point it's an 8-point favorite in the game, and I think people from the Oklahoma camp think about how on earth could Oklahoma be an 8-point favorite against anyone right now, the way that they've been playing. I think it's a little bit different, right? It's almost the Oklahoma's last road game against Iowa State, and we've got some similar data points because with your matchup against Iowa State last week, but I think this is almost a reverse when you look at West Virginia versus Iowa State. West Virginia has a much better offense than Iowa State does, but certainly not quite as good of a defense as Iowa State. So it's a different matchup, different challenge. Like I said, I would fully expect this game to be in the low point in the 30s right now, possibly a game that could get into the 40s.
If you had asked me before the Texas game, especially, our offense was humming at a certain point in the season. And I'm not sure exactly what happened, if it's the simplicity of the Graham Harrell scheme, because that's been an indictment. But other teams have figured it out some. But you look at JT Daniels, and Mark pointed this out. I didn't even looked at it this year until we talked last week. His yards per attempt are abysmal. 6-7 yards per attempt. Just horrible, and it's just not what I've seen on tape from JT Daniels. He throws an excellent deep ball. He showed it on tape everywhere he's been, and even early in the season he did it. For some reason, that's not happening anymore. It could be a receiver issue. We do have big-bodied receivers that would be considered possession receivers. We do have one slot guy that can get downfield, but it's been interesting with this offense. We're not humming like we were, So while I would love to get into a scoring match with you guys, because that'd be way more exciting than what we've been doing, I have my doubts until we see it on paper, evidenced by the depth chart. We have oars by every name at the quarterback spot. We don't even know if JT Daniels is going to start this week. We have a generational type quarterback for West Virginia that we've been waiting to see. He's the highest rated quarterback in 30 years that we've had. Nico Marchiol, the Arizona Gatorade Player of the Year. So we're not sure what the plan is. I mean, you got a guy coaching for his life, literally, in football. It's just so unpredictable what could happen. Do people press? Because players were, these guys obviously love these coaches, I think. So, are they going to press too hard and make too many mistakes, and that leads to it? I think that's been some of the problem there. So, but with that said, if our offense shows up like it can and everyone plays a little loose, yeah, we can score with you guys, definitely.
So that brings up an interesting question from my perspective, knowing that Neil Brown could be potentially coaching for his job these last few games of the year, and knowing how from what you've described, just in terms of the players really liking him and really wanting to play for him, does a win over Oklahoma, traditionally, yes, that means a lot. That would be something that could potentially in this situation save your job. But a win over Oklahoma this year, what's your feel like? Does that mean anything?
It means a lot. If you guys didn't have any wins, it would mean a lot. You guys are Oklahoma. We haven't beat you since we've been in the Big 12. So, yes, to be the first coach to beat Oklahoma, yes, that would, we have beaten you guys, but that was outside of the Big 12 in that Fiesta Bowl, which I will gladly reference anytime I get a chance. That was a team we thought we should have won the national championship that year, but that's completely off base. So I would be happy for these guys if they could pull this off, because none of us want to see it's actually painful to see what Neil Brown's going through week in and week out in these press conferences, and it bothers me. It really does. So I would love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, been following this Oklahoma team, obviously, as I do every year and covering them. I have no idea what to expect. I mean, I would certainly, I know that you'd listened to part of it, but they thought that they played a lot better on defense against Iowa State than they had a full. I felt like they regressed very, very much against against Baylor, and you guys were able to get that upset win against Baylor early in the season at home. So, and sort of a game, kind of a game where you were able to outscore Baylor, which they're not quite as good defensively as they've been in the last couple of years, but they're still decent defensively. So, I I still would see it going that direction more than anything else in this game, one way or the other. I feel like it'll probably be a field goal, 3 to 6 point game, one way or the other.
It's a game in the
Yeah.
Big 12. So, the league is the most parity driven league in the country. There's no question about it. Just look at West
Mhm.
Virginia's last 2 results. They play a team that was 0-5 in the conference, Iowa State that 0-5, but had the best ranked defense in the conference, and West Virginia loses that game, but coming off one game ago, taking on a team that's contending for the college football playoff. That was a 34-31 game with a few ticks left on the clock. So,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, it's been a tough league. Definitely.
Yeah,
We're proud of that. We're proud of that. I think that's something we can hang our hat on, and I think it's a big reason why we are going to be the third, possibly the third, and along with the Pac-12, it's going to be close. That third in revenue and going forward, just because of that parity. Hopefully, it keeps going forward.
What do you think the future of this league is, Paul, in regards to status within the Power Five, based on the moves that the SEC and the Big Ten have made, taking away from the Pac-12 and from the Big 12, and the 4 new additions coming in 2023?
Yeah. Great additions. I made a video earlier in the week about Gonzaga as well and how that situation played out, or at least the talk about it, and how I'm not a fan of it, because while they're a great basketball school and will certainly add to the basketball in the Big 12, which is probably the best. We West Virginia fans were in a Big East conference that started out as a basketball conference, decided they wanted to be a football conference, and then when all those football teams defected, we were left with trying to replace it, similar to the Big 12. And then when you start leaning towards these basketball schools, you drive a wedge between the football and basketball members. We saw it happen in the Big East. And, eventually that fell apart. So we people were saying it's going to be a one-off with Gonzaga. I'm not so sure. I'd just pump the brakes on it. Yormark does have a basketball background with the Nets, so I know he really believes in the basketball of this conference. So that's something that worries me about the conference as a whole going forward. But as far as football is concerned, it's the SEC and the Big Ten's world. We're all just playing it. I think we know that. But given from everything we've heard, the expansion of the playoff, we're going to have a seat at the table. And I think if you'd have told us that before that confirmation had happened, we would have been happy with it. Oklahoma fans, they really don't have to worry about it because they're moving on to the SEC. But we remaining members, you can't tell a West Virginia, who is the winningest team that's never won a national championship, you don't have a seat at the table. You can, but you're going to alienate a large group of the country. So I think I would just say good. I wouldn't say tremendous. I wouldn't say great, but I think we feel good about our standing, and then possibly being that third most strong conference, or however you want to word that. But would we like to move up? And is there potential to move up? I think there is. 10, 15 years from now, who knows what UCF, Cincinnati, BYU, who knows what they can do with those brands. We saw what Clemson did. We played them in the Orange Bowl 2012, beat them 70-33. Roll it forward 10 more years, you can say they're a top 5, top 6 brand in college football. When we played them, they weren't. So I think it's possible for teams to rebrand themselves and grow brand value with the right market, right time. Houston, UCF, you never know what they could be coming a few years from now. So I think there is potential for this conference. We'll see.
Well, those two in particular have a recruiting base that's phenomenal.
Yeah.
If they can tap into it. Obviously, they don't typically grab the top players from that area, but now being Power 5 members, maybe they can more often grab those players from, well, in Florida, they come from everywhere, but notably Miami and Florida State, but Ohio State and Alabama and everybody else dips in there. And the same thing with the Houston area, which there was a crazy statistic going back to the Ed Oliver Houston team of 2015 that beat Florida State, that finished 13-1, that they didn't have a player on the roster outside of like 75-mile radius of Houston. They just didn't need to leave to go
It's
to get
unbelievable.
players. So maybe they'll be able to, shun off the Texas and Texas A&Ms of the world and build a big football giant there at Houston like they've had decades ago.
Yeah. You look at how West Virginia has to recruit. It's nothing like that. We are truly, we don't have a home base. We do have maybe 3-4 kids a year that would be considered 3- and 4-star prospects and the rare 5-star prospect. And when we get them, we have to keep them in state, obviously, which is sometimes doesn't happen. You look at a Ryan Switzer who got out and went to North Carolina, was able to play with Trubisky and have those years that they had. He'd have been great in Daniel Holgerson offense. We let him go. But, yeah, so, we recruit a lot out of Florida. We had the Miramar pipeline. That's where we got Geno Smith and Stedman Bailey and those guys. But, yeah, we recruit nationally. We have to, and man, it would be nice to recruit a 75-mile radius.
And so that's where I would think, and then we'll spin this forward back to Oklahoma, where I would think West Virginia gets hurt by playing in the Big 12, because if you're an in-state West Virginia high school player, then that's one thing. But if you're playing in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and if, let's say, West Virginia was in the ACC and you went to West Virginia, well, you're playing all your games in the region, as opposed to, well, we're not going to see you play because you're going to be playing half of your schedule in Texas and Oklahoma. So
it's a big deal.
That's been difficult.
It's a tough sell. Before you could sell the offense, especially the skill position players. You could say, hey, look, it's the Big 12. You play this brand of football. And then, when Dana was here, you could point just to, we had Kevin White, Tavon Austin were both drafted in the top 10 of the draft as wide receivers. All you got to do is point to your NFL room and say, look who we've put in the NFL for this system. Here lately, it's funny how this league has gone. A lot of teams have gone into a more defensive style approach. You look at an Iowa State, a Baylor, and an Oklahoma State, especially from last year. Us, it's been interesting to see the revolution of that. So it's harder to recruit especially the skill position players that we used to.
Jason, we've got a question here from Joey Foster, our guy. Is Brent Venables needing more time to get his defensive style of players on the roster, or are they there and just not developed yet?
It's the $1 million question, I think. I think I lean more towards the players on the roster just not being good enough that they need to be for, not necessarily just for Venables' defense, but just for the University of Oklahoma just in general. So I think there is going to be some very, very significant roster turnover on this team after the year is over, very particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Now, the one thing that I don't necessarily give the coaching staff a pass on is when you look at TCU. TCU brought in a brand new coaching staff, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, new head coach, and they're not the best defense in the Big 12, but they're very
opportunistic.
Yeah, they're very opportunistic, and they're very, very serviceable, right? And in Oklahoma, for a vast majority of the Big 12 season, has not even been decent. Like I said, they're having problems just lining up correctly. So that is very much concerning, I think, at this point in the season, understanding they've had a full spring, they've had a full fall camp, and they've had 9 games in the season. And I get that there's teams that will give you different looks. Venables is one of those coaches who very much likes to see the alignment of the offense and then makes the adjustments. But whatever the reason is, the communication is breaking down, or the players aren't understanding what's happening. The message isn't being delivered. So I think what you have to assume here, because Venables has been successful everywhere he's gone. Like he came into this year as most people feel best defensive coordinator in the country. So, and had just tons of success at Clemson, obviously, and then success at Oklahoma before that. But I
Mm-hmm.
think, yeah, you give him time to get his players in there and see if you start to see improvement. Now, if we go in here, we're at this point this time next year, and we're talking about this, and this team still is having struggles lining up correctly, if they're still giving up, 35, 40, 50 points a game, and then you've got some real problems on your hand. But I think the biggest issue, and I reference this a lot. I listen to Gabe Eicher and Teddy Lehman, their podcast that they do once a week, and Teddy was about as down on the defense as he has been all year, and understanding that it's in the media. He's a guy that's not going to trash Venables, or he's not really necessarily going to trash the defense, because he played for the man, so there's a lot of mutual respect there. But he was about as negative, and I think the biggest negative is on the defensive line. There's a lot of players that just are continuously getting blocked. They're not getting off blocks. They're getting pushed around. They're being out physicaled. And so I think everything starts and ends up front in football on the offense and defensive line. So if you're consistently, you're not able to get pressure, you're consistently being pushed off the ball, you can't get in the backfield, then you're gonna have lots of problems. So we'll see what that roster turnover looks like at the end of the year, but I do think there's going to be some significant turnover, and I think this, unfortunately, this year, at least defensively, has just kind of been a wasted year. I think you're almost you're a year behind schedule if you're Oklahoma, because I think a lot of people, including myself, I mean, me and Mark, I think Mark, I'm not gonna throw you under the bus here, but I think Mark actually had picked Oklahoma to make the playoffs, and I thought they had an outside chance of making the
Sure.
playoffs, winning the Big 12. So I think you have to reevaluate your goals coming into next year, which I think the goals are what they were this year. Give yourself an opportunity to be in the mix, to at least play for a Big 12 title game. Sorry.
Yeah, if you're just playing the odds, picking Oklahoma to go to the playoff is usually never a bad thing. You're gonna hit on that more times than you don't.
I kind of backed into that selection. It was one of those deals where Oklahoma wasn't even in my mind about a playoff bid, and as a lot of people do, I think we're searching for something to figure out to get ahead of the curve. Who's going to be a factor outside of Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia? Who's going to surprise? Who's going to be? Obviously, well, we've got TCU and Tennessee that just about nobody anticipated. So anyway, I was in the course of doing my predictions, and I just kind of fell into Oklahoma after I did all the conference selections, looked at the schedules, made my predictions on each particular team, and then once I had them going to the Big 12 championship game and forecasted a win there. It just that's how it played out. And I had no forethought that I was going to be picking Oklahoma to play in the playoff. But once I added up the wins and losses, that's how it played out as a 2-loss playoff team.
Interesting. So one last thing about Oklahoma. So on defense, obviously everybody knows you guys were completely gutted when Lincoln left and went to USC. And I think that is a valid excuse for the way your team has showed up this year. But on defense, how much did you lose? I didn't remember hearing a whole lot about that.
So Oklahoma lost, I think, 3 guys that have that's really shown to be a big hole for Oklahoma. They lost 2 guys a lot along the defensive line, and Nick Benito and Perion Winfrey, and then they lost one of their starting linebackers who ended up getting drafted, Brian Asamoah. So you lost those guys, and I think coming in, I think there was some thoughts that this defensive line would not be quite as good as they were a year ago, at least on paper. But Oklahoma had Jalen Redmond coming back. He had kind of played off and on, but he'd been when he's been healthy, he'd been pretty good. And then you had Ethan Downs, where a lot of people thought he was making a big move. Reggie Grimes,
Yeah.
And it's just been one of those things where where nobody has really stepped up consistently. Ethan Downs has been a huge disappointment for this team this year. Reggie Grimes was very good early in the season, had 3 or 4 sacks through 2 games, and he's kind of just disappeared. Jalen Redmond will make maybe a play a game, but nothing like that, like what you would expect. So I think offensively, I think there's some things that Oklahoma was gutted by the by the Lincoln Riley move. But I think defensively you lost a few guys, but I don't think anyone expected the regression that we've seen this year. I thought, me personally coming in, I thought that this team had an opportunity to be probably maybe top 30, 35 in overall team defense this year.
Yeah.
Figured they would have some situations. Had some games here and there that they might regress, but overall would be a much better defense than they had. I never dreamed that this team could possibly be worse than they were last year, and that's where they are. This is arguably one of the worst teams, one of the worst defensive teams that Oklahoma has had in the history of the program, and that's saying a lot based on the defensive performances that they've had. The only game in the Big 12 that they've played decent defense is Iowa State. They gave up over 50 to TCU, 49 to Texas, and Texas could have scored 70. TCU could have scored 70 if they would have wanted to. Kansas State scored in the 40s. Baylor scored high 30s, and so it's just it's just one of those things that you didn't expect that to happen, but it has. And how do you move forward? I know that there's been some talk in the chat here about specifically good teams find a way to get better as the season season goes on, and that's not really happened with this team on the offense or the defensive side of the ball, which is concerning. You give coaches a pass the first year. I will never be the type of guy that will say, okay, Venables is not he's not doing a good job first year. But I've told Mark this on a couple of occasions. You've got to put you've got to put a lot of the blame on the players, but at the end of the day, you can't fire players. So I think I would be surprised if there's not some change on the defensive side of the ball after the year, just because they've been so bad defensively consistently each and every. Now, whether it's the defensive coordinator, which defensive coordinator in name only is Ted Roof. So I think he's the guy that I would be surprised if he's back next year, whether it's on his own or whether it is with with him being shown the door. But I do think that I say that you can't fire players. I guess you kind of can. You can tell them to very politely to hit the portal. But in this day and age, but again, I think you after 1 year. I mean, look at what not Brian Harston. Look at what Sark did last year. He changed some, he changed some things, and they're a lot better team this year. So I would anticipate someone moving on the defensive staff.
Yeah, and I understand why.